That evening, I decided to handle this the reasonable way. I drafted a respectful email to Margaret and the HOA board, explaining the nature of my business, the history of the property as Robert Chen's architectural office, and requesting a variance or exception that would allow me to continue meeting with clients in my home office. I included information about how home-based professional services were common and generally accepted in similar residential communities, and I offered to work with the board to address any specific concerns they might have about traffic or disruption to the neighborhood. Margaret's response came back within 2 hours, and it was shorter than my grocery list. Mr. Davidson, the HOA board has reviewed your request. Variance denied. Commercial activity must cease immediately. The fine remains in effect pending compliance. Margaret Foster, HOA President. I stared at that email for a long time, trying to figure out if I was missing something. There was no explanation of the board's reasoning. No acknowledgement of the precedent set by Robert Chen's decades of practice. No suggestion of alternative solutions or compromises. Just a flat denial and a demand for immediate compliance. It felt less like a reasonable enforcement of community standards, and more like someone had decided to flex their authority just because they could. Over the next few days, I tried reaching out to other board members, hoping to find someone more reasonable, or at least more willing to discuss the situation. But Tom Morrison, who I'd thought was a friend, suddenly seemed uncomfortable whenever I brought up the topic. Margaret's really passionate about maintaining our property values, he'd say, looking everywhere except at my face. Maybe it's better to just work with her on this. Jim Williams was even more direct. Look, Dave, I don't want to get crossways with Margaret. She's got strong opinions about this stuff, and honestly, it's easier to just go along than fight her on every little thing. That's when I realized this wasn't really about commercial activity or community standards. This was about power, and Margaret had decided to use me as an example of what happened to people who didn't ask permission before living their lives in ways she didn't approve of. The violation notice wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. It was about establishing that Margaret Foster was the one who decided what was acceptable in Willowbrook Estates. But Margaret had made a crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that I was just another suburban homeowner who would grumble about unfair treatment but ultimately comply rather than fight. She didn't know that I'd spent 15 years navigating Chicago zoning boards, planning commissions, and municipal bureaucracies that made our little HOA look like a kindergarten student council. More importantly, she didn't know about the phone call I'd received 3 weeks earlier. Just before this whole mess started, the call had come from David Chang, a development partner I'd worked with on several major projects in Chicago. David had been exploring investment opportunities in smaller markets, looking for communities with good growth potential and reasonable development costs. He'd heard that I'd moved to a lakefront community and wanted to know if I thought the area might be suitable for a high-end resort development project he'd been considering. I'd walked David around Willowbrook and the surrounding area, showing him the lake access, the mature trees, the proximity to the interstate, and the general appeal of the location. The more he saw, the more excited he became. This is exactly the kind of setting we're looking for, he'd said. Quiet, scenic, upscale residential area that could support a luxury hotel and conference center without overwhelming the existing character of the community. David's vision was impressive. He was talking about a $60 million investment in a 150-room luxury hotel and conference center that would be built on a 40-acre site about a mile from Willowbrook Estates. The development would include a spa, a championship golf course, fine dining, restaurants, and conference facilities that could host corporate retreats and destination weddings. More importantly for the existing homeowners, it would bring the kind of upscale amenities and economic activity that typically drove property values up by 25 to 30% in surrounding residential areas. We'd spent several hours driving around the area, and David had identified 3 potential sites that could work for the development. All of them were within a few miles of Willowbrook, which meant that our little community would become the closest high-end residential area to what David expected, would become the premier destination resort in the region. "Your neighbors are going to love this," he'd said. Properties in Willowbrook could easily increase in value by $150,000 to $200,000 each once the resort is operational and established. I'd agreed to do some preliminary site analysis and feasibility work for David, which was actually what I'd been discussing with the Hendersons when Margaret had stormed over with her violation notice. They weren't just potential residential clients. They were the first of several meetings I'd scheduled to discuss how the resort development might impact residential construction in the area and what opportunities that might create for custom home builders and architects. But now, as I sat in my home office reading Margaret's flat denial of my variance request, I was starting to see this situation differently. Margaret wanted to play power games and use heavy-handed tactics to control what happened in our community. She wanted to treat neighbors like subjects who needed to ask permission before living their lives. She wanted to turn reasonable community standards into weapons for enforcing her personal preferences about how other people should conduct themselves. Fine. If Margaret wanted to demonstrate that Willowbrook Estates was the kind of community where petty bureaucrats could destroy people's livelihoods over technical interpretations of poorly written rules, then maybe David needed to know what kind of neighborhood his potential guests would be staying near. If this was a community where established professionals could be harassed and fined for conducting normal business activities in home offices specifically designed for that purpose, then maybe this wasn't the right location for a luxury resort, catering to successful people who valued both quality and reasonableness. I didn't make any immediate decisions, but I did start documenting everything. Every interaction with Margaret, every email from the HOA, every conversation with neighbors who suddenly seemed nervous about being seen talking to me. I photographed the violation notice, saved all the email correspondence, and started keeping a detailed record of how this situation was affecting my business and my family's life in the community, because Margaret had made this personal, and I was starting to think that maybe it was time she understood what the real consequences of her actions might be. The harassment escalated quickly after that first violation notice. Margaret seemed energized by my lack of immediate compliance, interpreting my attempt to work through proper channels as defiance that needed to be crushed. The $500 fine was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, I received another violation notice, this one claiming that my continued commercial activity was now subject to daily fines of $100 per day until I achieved full compliance. She'd apparently been monitoring my driveway with the dedication of a private investigator, documenting every client, meeting, every delivery, every time a contractor stopped by to discuss potential projects. The second notice included more photographs, more detailed logs of times and dates, and a demand for immediate payment of an additional $1,400 in accumulated daily fines. But Margaret wasn't done. She'd also filed a complaint with the county zoning office, claiming that I was operating a commercial business in a residentially zoned area without proper permits. Never mind that home offices had been explicitly permitted under county zoning rules for decades, or that I wasn't changing the fundamental use of the property. Margaret had found another bureaucratic pressure point, and she was going to push it until something broke. The county zoning complaint triggered an official investigation, which meant I had to take time away from my actual work to meet with county officials, provide documentation of my business activities, and prove that my home office was in compliance with all applicable zoning regulations. The county ultimately determined that my use was perfectly legal and dismissed Margaret's complaint, but the process took 6 weeks and cost me several potential clients, who decided they didn't want to deal with the uncertainty and drama surrounding my business. Meanwhile, the HOA fines kept accumulating, $100 per day, every day, for what Margaret claimed was ongoing commercial activity violation. By the time the county dismissed her zoning complaint, the accumulated fines had reached nearly $4,000, and Margaret was now threatening legal action to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay immediately and cease all business activities. That's when Sarah started asking if maybe we should just find a commercial office space and avoid the whole mess. Emma was hearing about the conflict at school, since several of her classmates lived in Willowbrook, and their parents were apparently discussing the situation. "Maybe it's not worth fighting this," Sarah said one evening as we were cleaning up. "After dinner, you could rent a small office in town, meet clients there, and then this whole thing would just go away." She wasn't wrong, practically speaking. For a few $100s a month, I could rent an office space and eliminate Margaret's grounds for harassment. But the principle of the thing was eating at me. Robert Chen had run his architectural practice from this same home office for 30 years without anyone suggesting it was inappropriate or harmful to the community. The room had been specifically designed and built for professional meetings. The use was legal under county zoning, reasonable under any normal interpretation of community standards, and beneficial to property values, since professional services typically enhance rather than detract from a neighborhood's desirability. More than that, Margaret's approach set a precedent that bothered me deeply. If she could force me out of my home office through selective enforcement and harassment, what was to stop her from targeting other homeowners for other activities she personally disapproved of? Today it was my architectural practice. Tomorrow it might be someone's pottery studio, or music lessons, or any other normal home-based activity that generated occasional visitors. But there was something else. Something Margaret didn't know about, and couldn't have factored into her harassment campaign, while she'd been busy documenting my driveway traffic and filing complaints with the county. David Chang had been moving forward with his resort development plans. He'd hired a team of consultants to conduct market research, environmental studies, and economic impact analyses. He'd been meeting with county planners, state tourism officials, and potential investors. And the more research he did, the more excited he became about the potential for his luxury resort project. David had been calling me regularly for updates on the local market conditions, community attitudes toward development, and my assessment of how the resort might be received by existing residents. Initially, I'd been enthusiastic about the project and optimistic about community support, a luxury resort that could increase property values by $150,000 or more per home, while bringing high-end amenities and economic activity to the area. Seemed like the kind of development that any reasonable community would welcome. But as Margaret's harassment campaign intensified, I found myself giving David a different perspective on the community character and local attitudes. I told him about the HOA's aggressive interpretation of property restrictions, the willingness to harass established residents over technical rule violations, and the general atmosphere of petty bureaucratic control that seemed to be emerging under Margaret's leadership. I explained how the current HOA board seemed more interested in exercising power than in supporting the kind of quality development that would benefit existing homeowners. "That's concerning," David had said during one of our conversations. "We're looking at a significant investment in a community-oriented project that depends on positive relationships with local residents and government. If the local homeowners association is adversarial toward quality development and established professionals, that suggests we might face ongoing conflicts over every aspect of the project." I'd tried to be fair in my assessment, explaining that Margaret's behavior didn't necessarily represent the broader community, but David's concerns were reasonable. A luxury resort development is a long-term investment that requires community support to be successful. If the local HOA was willing to harass an architect for meeting with clients in a home office, what would they do when faced with a major development project that required variances, traffic studies, and ongoing coordination with local residents? Meanwhile, Margaret was preparing for what she apparently saw as the final phase of her campaign against my home office. The accumulated fines had now reached $6,000, and she'd retained a lawyer to begin the process of placing a lien on my property. She'd also started lobbying other neighbors to support her position, characterizing my resistance to the HOA's authority as a threat to everyone's property values and community standards. I heard about Margaret's lobbying efforts from Tom Morrison, who seemed genuinely torn between his personal friendship with me and his desire to avoid conflict with Margaret. She's telling people that if you get away with ignoring HOA rules, it opens the door for other people to do whatever they want, he explained. She's got some folks worried that property values will suffer if the association can't enforce its covenants. The irony was almost perfect. Margaret was concerned about property values while systematically attacking the exact kind of quality professional services that typically enhance property values in residential communities. She was worried about maintaining community standards while creating an atmosphere of harassment and bureaucratic hostility that would make most quality residents think twice about moving to Willowbrook. She was trying to preserve the character of the neighborhood by driving out the kind of established professional who had been part of that character for over 30 years. But Margaret's most serious miscalculation was her assumption that I was just another suburban homeowner with limited options and resources. She'd approached this conflict like someone who held all the cards and just needed to apply enough pressure to force compliance. She'd never considered the possibility that her harassment campaign might have consequences that extended far beyond our little neighborhood dispute. That realization hit me on a Thursday morning in late August, when I was supposed to meet with David Chang and his development team to review the final site analysis and community impact studies for the resort project. I'd been looking forward to that meeting for weeks, but as I was preparing my presentation materials, I found myself thinking about how to explain the current atmosphere in Willowbrook and what it might mean for the project's long-term success. David and his team arrived right on schedule, but instead of the enthusiasm I'd expected to share about the project's potential, I found myself explaining the ongoing conflict with the HOA and what it revealed about local attitudes toward quality development and professional services. I walked them through Margaret's harassment campaign, the escalating fines, the threats of legal action, and the general atmosphere of bureaucratic hostility that had emerged over what should have been a simple business operation in a home office designed specifically for that purpose. This is exactly the kind of community relations nightmare we're trying to avoid, said Jennifer Walsh, David's project manager. If the local HOA is this aggressive about a simple home office, imagine how they'll react to a major development project that actually requires variances, traffic management, and ongoing coordination with neighbors. David was quiet for a long time, looking out the office windows at the lake view that had initially captured his imagination for the resort's location. Finally, he turned back to me with an expression I'd seen before when he was making difficult decisions about project viability. Dave, this changes the risk profile significantly. We're talking about a $60 million investment that depends on community support and positive local relationships. If the neighborhood association is adversarial toward established professionals and quality development, we need to reconsider whether this is the right location. We spent the rest of that meeting discussing alternative sites, market conditions, and timeline considerations. David's team had already identified 2 other potential locations, one about 40 miles south and another in a different county entirely. Both alternatives offered similar amenities and market advantages without the complications of dealing with a hostile HOA that had demonstrated a willingness to harass residents over reasonable business activities. I didn't raise my voice when Margaret from the HOA board started waving that violation notice in my face, calling my architectural firm meetings unauthorized commercial activity. I just smiled, pulled out my phone, and called my investment partner, David. Yeah, it's time to pull out of Willowbrook. Find us another location. The silence in that community center was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. but Margaret's face turning the color of old concrete. That was worth the 18 months of harassment I'd endured. But let me back up, because this story starts in a completely different place, with completely different intentions. 2 years ago, I moved to Willowbrook Estates because I thought I'd found paradise. After 15 years of running my architectural firm in downtown Chicago, dealing with the noise, the stress, the constant hustle, I was ready for something quieter. My wife Sarah had been pushing for a change since our daughter, Emma, started high school, and when we saw the listing for 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, it felt like destiny. The house sat on 2 acres at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by mature oak trees, and backing up to a small lake that reflected the sky like glass every morning when I had my coffee. The previous owner, an elderly architect named Robert Chen, had designed the house himself back in 1987. It had this beautiful home office space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, built-in drafting tables, and enough room for a small conference area. Robert had run his practice from there for 30 years before retiring, and when I saw that workspace, I knew I'd found my sanctuary. Sarah loved the kitchen that opened onto a screened porch. Emma was thrilled about having her own bathroom, and I could already picture myself working on residential designs while watching the seasons change over that water. The neighborhood was exactly what we'd been dreaming of. Quiet streets where kids still rode bikes without parents hovering. Neighbors who waved but didn't feel the need to chat over the fence about every little thing. And an HOA that seemed to exist mainly to maintain the common areas and organize an annual block party. The Homeowners Association rules were standard stuff. Nothing that seemed unreasonable for maintaining property values and community standards. Keep your lawn reasonably neat. Don't paint your house neon colors. Don't run a daycare center out of your garage. Simple, sensible guidelines that any reasonable person could live with. For the first 6 months, life was exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd wake up at sunrise, make my coffee, and sit on that screened porch, planning my day while watching the mist rise off the lake. My firm was transitioning to a more residential focus anyway, so working from home made perfect sense. I'd meet with clients in that beautiful conference space Robert had created, show them plans spread out on the old drafting table, and close deals while overlooking some of the most peaceful scenery I'd ever had the privilege to work in. Sarah started a small pottery studio in the basement. Emma joined the swim team at the local high school, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were actually living instead of just surviving. The neighbors were wonderful. Tom and Linda Morrison lived across the street and had been there since the community was first developed. They'd known Robert Chen well and were delighted that another architect had bought his house. Jim and Patricia Williams lived next door, with their 2 younger kids, who got along great with Emma. Even Margaret Foster, who lived 3 houses down and served as the HOA president, seemed friendly enough in those early days. She'd wave when she drove past, and once stopped by with a welcome basket filled with local honey and homemade jam. That first year, I started getting more clients than I'd had in Chicago. Word spread that there was a quality architect working in Willowbrook, and my specialty in custom lake houses and rural residential design was apparently exactly what people in the area had been looking for. I was drawing plans for beautiful homes, working with clients who appreciated good design, and actually enjoying my profession again. After years of grinding through commercial projects that paid the bills but never fed my soul, the home office that Robert had designed was perfect for client meetings, with enough space for 4 or 5 people to sit comfortably around the conference table while reviewing plans and discussing ideas. But about 18 months in, something shifted. Margaret Foster got re-elected as HOA president, this time running on a platform of strengthening community standards and preserving residential character. I should have paid more attention to what that actually meant. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was meeting with a young couple, the Hendersons, who who wanted to build their dream home on a lot about 10 miles outside of town. We were discussing timber frame construction and looking at some beautiful photos of similar projects I'd completed when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the office windows, I could see Margaret Foster marching toward my front door with a folder clutched in her hand and an expression that suggested someone had personally insulted her ancestors. Sarah answered the door, and I could hear Margaret's voice rising from the foyer. "I need to speak with your husband immediately. There's been a serious violation of our community covenants." Sarah, bless her, stayed perfectly calm and asked Margaret to wait while she came to get me. I excused myself from my clients, who looked understandably confused about the commotion, and went to see what was so urgent it couldn't wait for a phone call. Margaret thrust a manila folder at me without so much as a hello. "Mr. Davidson, you are in violation of Section 7.3 of our community covenants, which specifically prohibits commercial activity in residential properties. I have documented evidence of multiple business meetings taking place at your residence, and I'm issuing you a formal notice of violation." She spoke like she was reading from a legal document, which I later realized she probably was. I opened the folder to find a formal violation notice, complete with dates, times, and descriptions of the commercial activity she'd observed. According to Margaret's meticulous notes, she'd been watching my house for weeks, documenting every client meeting, every delivery truck, every time someone who wasn't obviously a social visitor had come to my door. She'd even taken photographs from the street, showing different cars in my driveway during business hours. The notice demanded that I cease all commercial activity immediately and pay a $500 fine within 30 days or face additional penalties, up to and including legal action to force compliance. At the bottom, in smaller print, it mentioned that continued violations could result in fines of up to $100 per day until the activity stopped. I looked up from the papers to find Margaret, watching me with an expression of grim satisfaction, like she'd just solved a major community crisis. Behind her, I could see my clients through the office windows, checking their phones and clearly wondering what kind of drama they'd stumbled into. "Margaret," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'm an architect. I work from home. This has been a home office since 1987, when Robert Chen built this house specifically for his architectural practice." "That was different," she said, not missing a beat. "Mr. Chen was grandfathered in under the original covenants. You are not. The current rules are very clear about commercial activity in residential zones." She pointed to a specific paragraph in the violation notice. Section 7.3 states that no business activity generating client traffic, delivery traffic, or regular non-residential visitors shall be conducted on any residential property within Willowbrook Estates. I read the section she was pointing to, and technically, she wasn't wrong. The language was broad enough that it could be interpreted to include almost any kind of work-from-home situation that involved meeting with clients. But the idea that this rule was meant to prevent architects, accountants, or consultants from meeting with clients in their homes seemed absurd. "Margaret, this is a standard home office situation. I'm not running a retail business or operating a factory. I meet with clients to discuss architectural plans." "Commercial activity is commercial activity," she replied, folding her arms across her chest. "The rules don't make exceptions based on the type of business. If you want to run a commercial enterprise, you need to rent commercial space like everyone else." I wanted to argue, but my clients were still waiting, and I could see this conversation wasn't going to be resolved standing in my foyer. "I'll review this and get back to you," I said, which seemed to satisfy Margaret enough that she turned and walked back to her car, leaving me standing there with a violation notice that threatened to upend the work-life balance I'd spent 2 years creating. When I returned to my office, the Hendersons were polite about the interruption, but I could tell the whole scene had made them uncomfortable. We finished our meeting quickly, and they left with promises to call once they'd made some decisions about their timeline. I spent the rest of that afternoon reading through the HOA covenants, trying to understand how a rule that seemed designed to prevent someone from opening a auto repair shop in their garage could be applied to an architect meeting with residential clients in a home office that had been used for exactly that purpose for over 3 decades. By the end of the meeting, David had made his decision. We're going to move forward with the project, but we're going to focus on the alternative sites. This location still has tremendous potential, but the risk factors have gotten too high, given the local political climate. He looked directly at me when he said, "I'm sorry this worked out this way. Your analysis and insights have been invaluable, and I wish we were moving forward here. But sometimes the best business decision is knowing when to walk away from a situation that's turned adversarial." After David and his team left, I sat in my office for a long time, looking out at the lake view and thinking about what had just happened. Margaret's harassment campaign had successfully driven away a $60 million investment that would have increased property values throughout Willowbrook by an estimated $150,000 to $200,000 per home. Her concern about maintaining community standards had eliminated the kind of high-end development that would have made our neighborhood the most desirable residential area in the region. But Margaret didn't know about any of that yet. She was still focused on her campaign to force me out of my home office, still accumulating daily fines, still preparing for legal action to enforce her interpretation of the HOA covenants. She had no idea that her behavior had already cost the community millions of dollars in increased property values and economic development opportunities. That evening, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and property rights. The second was to Margaret Foster, requesting a meeting of the full HOA board to discuss a resolution to our ongoing conflict. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. Margaret had agreed to the meeting, apparently confident that she held the stronger position and that a formal board review would vindicate her enforcement actions. She'd probably expected me to come to the meeting ready to negotiate a surrender, maybe offering to pay the accumulated fines in exchange for permission to maintain my home office under some kind of restricted conditions. Instead, I came to the meeting with a simple announcement and a single document. The community center was more crowded than usual for a board meeting. Word had apparently gotten out that the conflict over my home office was going to be resolved one way or another, and neighbors who normally avoided HOA meetings had shown up to see how the situation would be concluded. Margaret sat at the front table with the other board members, looking satisfied and confident as she called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to discuss Mr. Davidson's ongoing violation of community covenants regarding commercial activity," she announced. "Mr. Davidson has requested this meeting to address his dispute with the board's enforcement actions." She looked at me with the expression of someone who expected to accept an unconditional surrender. "Mr. Davidson, you have the floor." I stood up and walked to the front of the room, carrying a single manila folder. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of folding chairs as people shifted to get a better view of what was happening. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice calm and conversational. "I wanted to speak with the board and the community tonight about the consequences of the HOA's recent enforcement actions." I opened the manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This morning I had a meeting with David Cheng and his development team from Cheng Properties International. They've been conducting feasibility studies for a $60 million luxury resort and conference center development that would have been located approximately 1 mile from Willowbrook Estates. I could see Margaret's expression starting to shift from confident satisfaction to confused concern, but I continued before she could interrupt. The resort would have included 150 luxury hotel rooms, a championship golf course, spa facilities, fine dining restaurants, and conference centers capable of hosting corporate retreats and destination weddings. The economic impact study projected that the development would increase property values in surrounding residential areas, including Willowbrook Estates, by an average of $175,000 per home. The room was completely silent now. I could see neighbors doing quick mental calculations of what that kind of property value increase would mean for their family finances, their retirement planning, their children's college funds. Unfortunately, I continued, Mr. Chang and his team have decided to relocate their development to an alternative site due to concerns about local community relations and the regulatory climate. I looked directly at Margaret, as I said. They cited the HOA's aggressive enforcement actions against established residents and its apparent hostility toward professional services as evidence that this community might not be supportive of quality development projects. Margaret was starting to look pale, but I wasn't finished. So I want to thank the board, and especially President Foster, for helping me understand exactly what kind of community Willowbrook Estates has become under the current leadership. I closed the manila folder and looked around the room at neighbors, who were starting to realize what they'd just lost. The $60 million resort development, the job opportunities, the increased property values, the community amenities, all of that is now going to benefit another community that values quality development and maintains positive relationships with established residents. I turned back to Margaret, who was sitting frozen in her chair, like someone who'd just watched a truck bearing down on her at high speed. As for the commercial activity violation, you can keep the fines. I'll be moving my architectural practice to a commercial office space in town, partly to avoid further harassment, but mostly because I've realized that a community willing to drive away $60 million in quality development over a home office dispute probably isn't the kind of place where I want to continue building my professional reputation. The silence in that room was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Margaret was staring at me with an expression of complete shock, like someone who'd just realized they'd accidentally set their own house on fire while trying to light a candle. The other board members were looking back and forth between Margaret and me, clearly trying to process what they'd just heard. Finally, Tom Morrison spoke up from the back of the room. Dave, are you saying that the resort development is definitely not happening here? His voice sounded like someone asking for confirmation that yes, the lottery ticket he'd just torn up was actually worth $10 million. That's correct, I said. Chang Properties has identified 2 alternative sites, both in communities where the local homeowners associations have demonstrated more positive attitudes toward quality development and professional services. They'll be moving forward with one of those locations within the next 60 days. The meeting devolved pretty quickly after that. Neighbors started asking Margaret direct questions about whether she'd known about the resort development, why she hadn't considered the economic impact of her enforcement actions, and whether there was any way to reverse the developer's decision. Margaret tried to maintain her authority by insisting that HOA rules had to be enforced equally, regardless of economic considerations. But her voice sounded increasingly hollow as people started calculating exactly what her enforcement campaign had cost them personally. Jim Williams, my next-door neighbor, stood up and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Margaret, are you telling us that you destroyed a development project worth millions of dollars to the community because Dave was meeting with clients in his home office? When Margaret started to respond with something about the importance of consistent rule enforcement, Jim cut her off. This is insane. Dave's an architect. Meeting with clients is what architects do. Robert Chen did the same thing for 30 years, and nobody had a problem with it until you decided to make it a federal case. The meeting ended with Margaret calling for adjournment and storming out of the community center, followed by several neighbors who were clearly continuing the argument in the parking lot. I packed up my manila folder and headed home, leaving behind a room full of people who were just beginning to understand what they'd lost and why. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within a week, 3 of the 5 HOA board members had resigned, citing their lack of confidence in the current leadership's decision-making processes. Margaret submitted her resignation as president 2 days later. In a tersely worded email, that blamed unreasonable pressure from certain residents for her decision to step down from volunteer service to the community. A new board was elected within the month, and one of their first actions was to revise the community covenants to explicitly permit reasonable professional home offices, provided they didn't create noise, traffic, or other genuine nuisances for neighbors. They also voted to waive all fines related to my home office activities and issued a formal apology for the previous board's overreach and poor judgment in this matter. But the real changes were more subtle and longer lasting. Property values in Willowbrook had been steadily rising for years, but they plateaued after word got out that the resort development had moved to a different location. Houses that had been selling quickly in a seller's market started sitting on the market for longer periods. The lake view that had once commanded premium prices began to feel less special when everyone realized it could have been the backdrop for a world-class resort that would have made Willowbrook the premier residential address in the region. Margaret moved away about 6 months later, selling her house to a young couple who got a great deal in what had become a buyer's market. I heard through Tom Morrison that she'd relocated to a community in Florida, where the HOA rules were even more restrictive and the enforcement was even more aggressive. She'll probably be happy there, Tom had said with a rueful smile. They've got rules about everything, and everybody follows them. As for me, I did end up renting a small office space in town, partly because the whole experience had left a bad taste in my mouth about working from home, and partly because my business had actually grown as a result of all the attention from the HOA dispute. Apparently, there were a lot of people in the area who valued an architect willing to stand up for reasonable professional practices and community development. David Cheng's resort opened 2 years later in the alternative location he'd chosen, about 50 miles south of Willowbrook. It was everything he'd envisioned, a luxury destination that brought high-end tourism, quality jobs, and significant increases in surrounding property values. The community that welcomed the development saw residential property values rise by an average of $190,000 per home, along with new restaurants, shopping, and recreational amenities that transformed the entire area into one of the most desirable places to live in the region. Sometimes I drive past Willowbrook on my way to client meetings, and it looks exactly the same as it did 5 years ago. Same quiet streets, same well-maintained homes, same peaceful lake views. It's still a perfectly nice place to live, and property values have remained stable, which is more than a lot of communities can say in today's market. But I can't help wondering what it would look like now if Margaret Foster had been less concerned about controlling her neighbors and more interested in supporting the kind of quality development that builds communities instead of just preserving them. Every time I see that lake view, I think about the luxury resort that could have been there, the jobs that could have been created, the property values that could have doubled, and the community amenities that could have made Willowbrook truly special instead of just adequately pleasant. The new HOA board sends me an annual newsletter, and they always include a note thanking me for my patience and professionalism during a difficult period in our community's history. They're good people doing their best to learn from past mistakes and build a more positive future. But some opportunities, once lost, don't come around again. Margaret got what she wanted, a community where the rules are enforced consistently and nobody operates a business from their home office without explicit permission. The rest of us got a lesson in the difference between maintaining standards and strangling opportunity, between preserving community character and destroying community potential. And sometimes late at night, when I'm driving home past that quiet lake, I think about how sometimes the most expensive victories are the ones where you get exactly what you asked for.